Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann. Today I wanted to talk briefly about two bug books, one of which I read very recently, and that's this one, The Butterfly Effect, Insects and the Making of the Modern World by Edward D. Melillo. And go ahead and place a bet on how often I'm going to mess up Melillo and get it confused with Don DeLillo, another author who I like a lot. So anyway, I read this recently. I'll talk about it more in a second. And then after that, I'm going to touch briefly on Bugs in the System, Insects and Their Impact on Human Affairs by May Berenbaum, which I read several years ago. But these books are both similar in that they take the relationship between insects and humans and they break it down into a popular science book. So these books would be very accessible for people who don't have a scientific background. And the reason that I've read them is partly because I am an entomologist in some sense, and I really like bugs, so I wanted to see what these books were about. But also, I was interested in reading them now that I'm a college professor, thinking about designing my own courses and thinking about things that would be more accessible to a broader student audience. So this one, the Edward Melillo book that I read recently, I thought was absolutely excellent. I thought the writing was really great. And he is not a scientist. I forget exactly what he is. But he's a college professor in more of like a political science, sociology, environmental policy sort of sense. So this book contained much less about the background science of insects and was very heavy on the role that insects have played in the history of human cultures and development. So we get whole chapters on things like the silkworm and the role that that played in the silk trade. We get a whole chapter on coccineal dye, which is a red dye that's derived from crushing the bodies of coccinellid bugs, which are in the Western Hemisphere. And so one statistic I learned from this book that I didn't know before is that coccineal dye was the #2 export for the Spanish from their Western Hemisphere colonies. So really, this one dye had a huge impact on the economics and global empire at that time. So that was absolutely fascinating. He has a whole chapter about eating insects, about the protein that we get from insects and the cultural histories of that and what it might mean for the future. So this one is really just, for someone who's really curious about bugs from that sort of cultural, historical, sociological perspective. This book, I think, is a really fantastic read. Oh yeah, another one was shellac, which is also a bug-made product. And really kicked off our music industry at the start of the 20th century, and is now also making a comeback as a food preservative and even as something for making records and things like that. And one thing he mentions is that these things that we used to make out of natural products and then replaced with synthetic alternatives in the early 20th century, a lot of those the natural products are starting to come back now. And in part, that's because we realize the synthetic versions aren't as good. So in the case of the cochineal, I guess it's cochineal, I was saying coccineal. The cochineal dye, that red dye from the cochineal bugs, a lot of the synthetic red dyes that we've used as alternatives are really bad for human health. And so when we use them in food, bad things can happen. And so now a lot of processed food products are going back towards using that cochineal dye. So really cool. And then he talks a little bit about pollinators, my jam, and our reliance on insect pollination. So this is just a great book for someone who doesn't want to encounter anything that looks like science, but still wants to learn a little bit about this like tight relationship that humans have had with bugs throughout our history. And again, I thought it was just really well written, clearly really exhaustively researched. This was a fantastic read. And this came out fairly recently, and I noticed when I read the little author, the author bio, that he graduated from my alma mater, which is Swarthmore College. So I was like, yay, Swarthmore. Anyway, all right. And then the other one, Bugs in the System by May Berenbaum, that I read several years ago, was also excellent, but it was quite different. And even though it does touch on some of the same topics, so it touches on the silkworms, I think it touches on the cochineal bugs, but there's a lot more basic information about insects in here. So May Berenbaum is one of our most prominent entomologists from the late part of the 20th century and through to today. She's just, one of the one of the biggest names in entomology, and apparently is a really wonderful person as well. I've never met her, but this book again touches on some of the same topics, but then also goes a lot farther. So she has a lot more in here about insects as parasites and disease vectors. She has a lot more about insects themselves. So just how do they live? So she'll have basic science about social insects, basic science about the different things that insects eat, whether they're vegetarian insects that eat plants, or like I mentioned, things like parasites and disease vectors, and other cool carnivorous insects. So hers is a lot more, she's got a whole chapter on behavior here. So how do insects behave? So she takes approach, if I remember correctly, that she presents some really basic insect science at the level that any general reader should be able to understand, and then she does interweave it through, how have these insects been tied up with human history and culture and economics as well. But she doesn't hit that sort of as hard and as deeply as Melillo does. So two books that do very different things. And again, I haven't read this one in a while. But I think like both of these books, I think would be really appropriate for me. For example, thinking about teaching something like a freshman year seminar, it's like I could do both of these books because, one would really introduce people to this idea of the tight interweaving that we've had with insects. That would be the Melillo book, really delving into our history in that respect. And then Bugs in the System would provide nice sort of snippets and snapshots of like, okay, what's the science behind what insects do, these insects that have played a huge role in human history. So I highly recommend both of these books for anyone who's curious about learning more about insects, and especially how they have interwoven through our history. And with that, I think I'll sign off, but thanks for watching, and I hope to make a new video soon. Bye.